We will record every day, and then we'll make that available later. Has that started? Can you see that, Ashley? Okay, I don't see all the same stuff when I'm screen sharing.
Yep, you're good.
Good, okay. So I think you'll all come in muted anyway. So we ask that you keep that way unless you have a question, and we're in a question period. And not today, but in the next couple of days, we will do breakout rooms, and those won't be recorded. You can use the chat as much as you like, to us, to each other. And there's the raise your hand button, which shows up under reactions. So today we have a few presentations. We will go through some of the basic stuff at first. Then we have Tina, who is from the East Coast Environmental Law Group, and she's going to talk to us a bit about climate change in the context of municipal liabilities and responsibilities. And then we have Joel coming, who's going to talk about climate data and how to use it and what it all means. We'll have a short break, and then we'll get into the story behind this workshop and the plan going forward for the week. And then I'll do some logistical stuff with that. And that'll be Ashley and I from Fundamental. So now, before we continue any further, I'll give the land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatudavut, and the Innu of Nitassen and their ancestors, as well as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. So Joe, you can go ahead and give your little spiel.
Sure. Hi everybody. I'm Joe Durayo. I'm Associate Professor in Civil Engineering at Memorial University. Pardon me. I'll kind of give a brief overview of the BRACE project. So this is funded by Natural Resources Canada. You can see there it means building regional adaptation capacity and expertise. We started this project, I guess in 2018. Initially, it was led by the province. So the Climate Change Office what led the proposal and led all this. And the reason that they did this was because there was not a lot of uptake of climate data and climate tools that the provincial government had available for use by professional engineers in design and planning of infrastructure. So this program was really a way to help train and talk about big issues that professional engineers need to be concerned with climate change adaptation. There have been a few changes and amendments to our project, and one was to bring planners in a couple of years ago, and then along the way, it became more and more clear that while we were reaching out to professionals, engineers, planners, and other technical folks, it became clear that in order to really build capacity, we really needed to reach out to municipalities and decision makers in municipalities and people who have an interest in this from the public perspective, because this is based on public infrastructure. So kind of in a nutshell, the engineers can't do it on their own. Everybody needs to kind of understand what needs in general, what needs to be done, how things work, and our responsibilities towards climate change adaptation. And so we were able to get another change in our funding program, and folks from NRCan have been fantastic throughout this whole project. But we got some extra funding to do this workshop. This will be the last one. Our project's winding down, and so this is our effort to reach out to municipalities, and we have a lot of engineers on the call as well. And we're hoping to one of the things we're hoping to get is some connections and communication, improved communication, especially between technical and non-technical folks. Yeah, I think that's about it. You can see I'll just highlight. So I'm at Memorial. Of course, the provincial government has been involved with this. Paganel, if you don't know, Paganel is the professional engineers and geoscientists, Newfoundland and Labrador. So they are responsible for licensing and other aspects of for engineers. Engineers Canada is the national level of that to some degree. Of course, MNL has been involved throughout this, and then we've had some interactions and the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Professional Planners as well. So I think that's kind of wraps up the program. I mean, that's in general. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to let me know. But I'll throw it back to Emma.
Correct. Thank you, Joe. So we're ready for my lovely descriptions here for myself. Tina, you are welcome to share your own screen. You should have that ability as co-host. And then we will let you get started.
Thank you. Just give me a sec here to
Yeah, no problem.
screen share and bring up the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. And just need to, it's always tricky when you've got all of the various Zoom things popping up in your way of your buttons. All right, here we go. We should be able to.
Great. I do have your little introduction if you'd like me to read that, or you can introduce yourself. Up to you.
Happy to introduce myself since we've gotten started.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So my name's Tina Northrup. I'm a staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law, and I've actually got a little slide that just provides a bit of an about East Coast Environmental Law. So maybe I'll just skip to that in a second. But as you maybe just before I do that, I'll say that the talk I'll be giving today, the title of it is the same title as a larger research project and a resource that we've developed on behalf of and through partnership with the organization Climate Atlantic. And so the title of my talk comes from that broader work, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that in just a few moments. But just to give you a sense of what it's called Climate Risk, Responsibility and Liability for Municipalities, exploring municipalities' responsibilities to consider, manage, and disclose climate change flood risks. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll get into the genesis of that research and where we ended up going with it. So East Coast Environmental Law, which is where I work, is an environmental law charity, and we provide public interest environmental law services throughout Atlantic Canada. So our vision is a future in which laws and legal systems protect ecological health and promote environmental and climate justice in our region. And then to realize that vision, we do a number of things. The key pillars of our work are advocacy for progressive environmental law and policy. So that it includes law reform advocacy and research into the effectiveness of existing laws. We also do a lot of work providing public legal education on environmental law and policy, and the research that we've done for Climate Atlantic kind of falls under that heading of our work to a large part. And we also, in various ways, work to share our legal skills to support individuals, communities, and organizations that are working to prevent or redress environmental harm. So we do a lot of public interest support to individuals and community groups that need to understand environmental issues more clearly and understand the laws and decision-making processes that they need to navigate with respect to the issues they're facing. And we also do a lot of support for organizations that have advocacy objectives or broader community support objectives and need to have legal information that will help them to engage more effectively. And to some extent, our work with Climate Atlantic has been along those lines as well. So the work that we've done for Climate Atlantic, and which I'll be speaking to today, comes through the sort of intersections between the work that we do and the work that Climate Atlantic does. So for those on the call who don't know, and I know that there are some Climate Atlantic staff persons on the call today, I saw them coming in, but for those who don't know, Climate Atlantic is a regional organization that aims to facilitate access to information and data that will support climate change adaptation in Atlantic Canada. And like our organization, Climate Atlantic really foregrounds the value of collaboration, networking, and partnerships, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the work that we've done has been such a good experience up to this point. So in the summer and up into the autumn and sort of up to the present now, we were conducting legal research and analysis for Climate Atlantic that sought to answer some core questions they had about municipal risk, responsibility, and liability with respect to climate change adaptation. And since that's a really, really big topic, we narrowed it down and started with focusing on the area of climate change flooding in particular. So the research really focused on responsibilities and potential liabilities with respect to preparing for flooding that we can anticipate as a result of climate change. And that could take a number of forms. So ultimately, the product of the work that we did is a written resource that asks and seeks to answer the following core questions. We asked, what are municipalities' legal responsibilities to consider, manage, and disclose climate change flood risks? And what liabilities could municipalities face if they fail to meet those responsibilities? So the written report is done, but hasn't been released publicly yet. And my understanding is that Climate Atlantic staff are still working on their strategy and plans for release. And I'm not entirely clear on what the final decisions will be in terms of when it will be out and to, where it will be accessible and how they're going to roll it out. So I'm afraid I can't answer those questions today, but certainly I think that rollout will happen in the not too distant future. And the resource should be available in some form and hopefully will be of some help to municipalities going forward. I'll say that for those who may be interested in accessing it in the future, it's really not intended to be a resource that answers every legal question that a municipality might have. And it's not designed to provide tailored legal opinion or advice. It really takes a high-level overview approach to the core questions, and it contains a lot of information, but it nevertheless is high-level information rather than situation-specific advice. So it's meant to be more of a guidepost and a kind of let's start thinking about some of these things and get a sense of what the issues are and where we should be putting our minds, but it doesn't necessarily answer every specific question that a municipality might have. And in particular, it might raise some questions that it then can't answer, and municipalities might need to seek more specific and tailored legal advice. So I'm going to today, in the time that I have, give you just a general overview of the work we did and the issues we covered, but then I will spend a little bit more time talking about a couple of things that I think will be more specifically of interest, and I'll leave a few minutes for Q&A too. So I won't take any longer than 20 minutes, just sort of talking myself, and then that should leave us about 10 minutes for Q&A. And if you want me to dig into anything more deeply that I've skipped over quite quickly, I'm happy to do that then. So just a sense of terminology, so just so we're on the same page as I go into this. As we framed up the research and the written resource that we prepared, by necessity, we had to sort of, put some framework around the concepts and the terms we were using. So our concept of climate change flood risk is what we mean by that is a combination of two things: the realistic possibility of climate change flood hazards, and then vulnerability to loss and damage as a consequence of climate change flood hazards. So when we talk about climate change flood hazards, we mean hazards that are caused or exacerbated by climate change. So hazards like sea level rise, coastal storm surges, increased precipitation, storm frequency, storm intensity, things we're already seeing today. And then risk, climate change flood risk, is a combination of those hazards plus vulnerability to the consequences of them. So flood risk could include potential consequences of municipal infrastructure breaking down because it hasn't been built or maintained in such a way that it can withstand the increased frequency or intensity of the flood hazards that we might anticipate. And then when we talk in the report about considering climate change flood risks and managing and disclosing them, with respect to considering, what we mean is, taking them into account in some way, such as trying to figure out whether they ought to be informing asset management and land use planning and development permitting. By managing flood risks, we mean taking actions to avoid, mitigate, or even possibly accept them on the basis of informed and conscientious decision-making. Doesn't necessarily mean eliminating the risks, but figuring out how the risks are going to be addressed or accepted in some way. And then by disclosing, we mean sharing information about flood risks with either the public at large or with specific persons that are most likely to be harmed. So what the written resource does ultimately is we started by identifying categories of potential sources of municipal responsibility to consider, manage, and disclose climate change flood risks in Atlantic Canada. We identified 5 broad categories where in our minds, those are kind of the key categories where you're likely to see these issues arising, or where you're likely to see responsibility being located from a legal perspective. So enabling legislation, the statutes that empower municipalities and shape their responsibilities. External legislation, such as environmental statutes of various kinds that may set out requirements for certain standards to be met or certain actions to be taken to prevent environmental harms or personal injuries. The common law, which is often called judge-made law. It's the law that emerges from court decision making on the basis of precedent, trying to resolve similar issues in similar ways over generations. The Constitution of Canada is potentially also a source of responsibility. And then finally, funding agreements and other contractual relationships where parties might agree to binding legal requirements that say you have certain responsibilities to consider such and such or address such and such in order to receive this funding or in order to abide by the terms of our contract. So those are the 5 categories of potential sources of responsibility that we identified and speak to. And then we explore those sources of responsibility with an eye to 3 key spheres of municipal activity. And these we drew from our review of case law in Atlantic Canada and across Canada more generally, that looks at the key places where municipalities have historically tended to find themselves in legal trouble when it comes to flood loss and damage. So management of municipal infrastructure, land use planning, and development permitting are kind of key areas where historically there's been a fair bit of dispute and litigation. So in terms of key findings for those categories, I mean, one of the things that we found was that in Atlantic Canada, municipalities, for the most part, don't have any clearly legislated responsibilities to consider, manage, or disclose climate change flood risks. And what we mean by that is that the enabling statutes and regulations that empower municipalities in Atlantic Canada and set out their roles and responsibilities, for the most part, don't speak to climate change flooding at all. The one example or the one exception is a policy that exists in Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's the policy for floodplain management, which does speak a little bit to climate change flooding. But even that is a policy. It's not legislation in and of itself, even though it's been designed to intersect with legislation. So that is the one place currently that we found where climate change flooding is actually being explicitly contemplated in the laws that are shaping municipal responsibility in this area. And again, it's a policy, not a law, even though it's designed to intersect. So to say just a little bit more about that, I mean, essentially the policy for floodplain management in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's rooted in the provincial government's powers under the Lands Act and the Water Resources Act, but it's designed to intersect with the Urban and Rural Planning Act 2000 and shape how land use planning within the province will be carried out under that act. The way that we see this in part is that under the Urban and Rural Planning Act, municipalities have discretionary powers to engage in land use planning in certain instances when municipal planning areas have been designated by the provincial minister of municipal, provincial and municipal affairs, or municipal and provincial affairs. And so once those requirements are in place, then municipalities have this discretionary power to engage in land use planning, but ultimately land use plans that are developed by municipalities and development regulations that are associated with them have to be submitted to the minister for review and approval. And the minister has to determine if they are contrary to law or contrary to government policy. So it's that ministerial determination of whether a municipal plan or proposed regulation is contrary to provincial law or policy that can bring that policy for floodplain management into view and have it then intersect with the way that land use planning is happening And because the policy does speak to climate change flood zones, and it sets some priorities that address developments in identified climate change flood zones, it does create this regime whereby you could see some responsibilities arising there. So again, this is the one example that we found in all of Atlantic Canada where a regime is being set out in law and policy to date that starts to address some of these issues. In terms of external legislation, I'll just say very briefly, because we didn't dwell on this in the written resource, we didn't do a comprehensive review of all of the various external statutes and regulations, like Environmental Protection Acts or federal acts like the Fisheries Act or the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, where there might be some requirements set out that create liability. But we did just offer a few examples, just really to illustrate a message that is a key message in the resource, but also a fairly basic message that I think probably most municipalities are familiar with, which is that if you don't manage municipal infrastructure in good ways, or you're not kind of turning your mind to various requirements that are set out under laws, you could possibly find yourself in a situation whereby an accidental release of effluent or some other kind of unanticipated breakdown that results in environmental pollution or contamination of some kind that could trigger liabilities under various environment statutes and regulations. So a fairly basic point, but one worth mentioning, because when we think about the context of climate change and climate change adaptation, certainly management of municipal infrastructure is part of that picture of thinking about those kinds of liabilities. The common law is an area that we dwell on at length in the report, in large part because of the fact that our research found that there aren't a lot of clearly legislated responsibilities. So in the absence of legislated responsibilities that are set out explicitly in statutes and regulations, you start to think about, okay, well, where else in the law might there be responsibilities that municipalities may need to know about? And that's when you start to think about the common law and laws like the laws of negligence, nuisance, or other potential torts, civil wrongdoings that could create troubles for municipalities. So we do a review of a number of different torts: nuisance, negligence, trespass to land, a tort called the Rule and Rylands and Fletcher, which is quite a specific little tort that comes from some 19th century case law. So we address a number of those things, but ultimately what we found in our case law research was that of the common law sources of liability, the law of negligence is the likeliest source of municipal liability, in our opinion, just based on the common law, and then also the reality that many municipalities have limitations of liability set out expressly in legislation that limit liability for other torts like nuisance, for example. With respect to the law of negligence, there's also a kind of subcategory of negligence called failure to warn that we explored, in part because it was flagged for us by Climate Atlantic as a question that was top of mind for them. And so we took a fair bit of time to look into that as well. And so the report gets into that one as well. And we won't have a lot of time today to dig into these in detail. But the thing about negligence that the written resource highlights, and that I would highlight here, and I'm happy to speak to maybe in a bit more length in the Q&A period, is this long-standing distinction that exists in the law of negligence between what the courts call core policy decisions and operational decisions by governmental authorities. So the law of negligence creates this protective sphere in which governmental authorities, including municipalities, can be immunized from liability in negligence with respect to core policy decisions, if those decisions are made rationally and in good faith. So this is an area of the law that really does matter a lot to municipalities when it comes to thinking about responsibilities to consider and to do something about climate change consequences that are foreseeable in the years to come. Ultimately, the law of negligence, or the common law of negligence, as Canada's courts have defined it over time, it recognizes that municipalities, like all other governments, they have limited resources to work with, and they're not going to be able to do everything and address every problem and fix every piece of infrastructure that needs to be fixed or strengthened to be more resilient over time. And they recognize that governments need to prioritize things in relation to limited resources that they have. So, the law doesn't require municipalities to be able to do everything all at once, all the time, but it does require deliberative, good faith, rational decision making that really grapples with the issues, sees them for what they are, recognizes them, and tries to figure out a good way of going forward with the resources that are in place. And core policy decisions, when a core policy decision has been made by a municipality, is then going to be a sphere in which a court will ultimately kind of choose not to intrude, or at least that's how the law is structured. So it means ultimately that a court under the law can't find liability and negligence for something that it recognizes as a core policy decision. By contrast, an operational decision is the kind of decision that happens when, say, a core policy is set out at a high level. So, for example, a core policy decision might be, we are going to decide as a municipality to prioritize infrastructure repair, infrastructure upgrading in such and such an order over the next 10 years or something like that. And so then we'll just take the identified infrastructure pieces in that order, and we'll upgrade them as we can. That's maybe a core policy decision. Then the operational decision related to that would be, when you actually go to upgrade the infrastructure, that upgrade needs to be done according to acceptable objective standards. If, say, the design or the actual follow through in terms of doing whatever it takes to upgrade is done in a faulty way, and so then something happens and somebody's harmed, that kind of work could then still be subject to liability and negligence. So moving on from that, the constitutional question in the report is addressed because it was flagged for us by Climate Atlantic that we've seen a fair bit of litigation in Canada and elsewhere where claims are being made on the basis of human rights or rights and freedoms that are set out in various constitutions or charters, and so there was an interest in having a sense of what that might mean for municipalities. And so what we discuss in the written resource is that in Canada to date, there have been 4 key court cases that have relied on rights and freedoms set out in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and have used those rights and freedoms as bases to allege that inadequate action by governments to either mitigate or mostly mitigate climate change has violated charter rights. Only one of those court cases is still proceeding. The other 3 have been discontinued, and none of them were against municipalities as defendants. So we talk about that a little bit in the resource, but one of the points that we make is that the case law to date hasn't been particularly favorable to the plaintiffs who have brought the litigation. But the courts have recognized in their decisions, and their reasoning does suggest that courts are open to the idea of the common law evolving and changing to meet the realities of the climate crisis. And, the common law is law that evolves over time and is meant to evolve over time in keeping with social needs and social changes. And so I would never go so far as to say that a municipality should rest confident or, be overly reliant on an idea that the common law would never evolve in such a way that the kinds of claims that have been put forward would not succeed. And similarly, even though we haven't yet seen such cases against municipalities as defendants, I certainly would not say that might be impossible in the future, because I think it is it could be a possibility. We just haven't seen it yet. So that section of the written resource mostly just kind of describes how things stand now. And then finally, the aspect of the resource that talks about funding agreements and other contractual relationships, also something that we don't go into in too much detail. Mostly we just flag the reality that contractual arrangements are arrangements where parties, agree to binding terms. And we have seen to date some funding arrangements, whether coming down federally or provincially, where the expectation is that, if monies are going to municipalities to do infrastructure upgrades or other kinds of planning or asset management activities that that certain things may need to be taken into account, potentially long-term sustainability, potentially climate adaptation needs. So, if a municipality is trying to think about all of its potential legal responsibilities and liabilities, certainly looking to contractual relationships shouldn't be missed as part of a review or scan that a municipality might be doing. So that is a very kind of quick overview of the report that we did with a couple of little spotlights, and I'll end there to save some time for discussion. And as I said, if folks want me to drill down more deeply into any of the topics that I raised, I'm happy to do that. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then yeah.
Thank you, Tina. So yeah, we have a question period now. If anyone has anything to ask, you can either type it in the chat and we'll read that out, or you can raise your hand and then we can unmute you, whatever you're comfortable with.
So Tina, I have a question maybe just to get us started. So just sort of doing a little bit of like role playing and thinking about municipalities that we work with often as fundamental, like large or small. If I understood you clearly, looking at, so if we were, for example, a small municipality and we had a small operating budget, and recognize that like some of the like major infrastructural interventions that we could do to address climate adaptation would just be, I mean, inconceivably large budgets for us to deliver.
Mm-hmm.
Can you sort of talk around like what the likely expectation would be in that circumstances? Like, I mean, if someone were to say, like a $50 million project when we had an operating budget of like less than $1 million a year sort of situation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, happy to speak to that. And I mean, just with the caveat that, everything I'm about to say is a kind of, high level hypothetical, and I wouldn't want it to be relied on as specific advice that's been given. But we do offer some like hypothetical case studies in the written resource. And one of them, as you probably maybe remember, speaks to this. What I would say there is that because of the way the courts have framed the core policy sort of carve out in the common law of negligence, what is expected is for municipalities or other governmental authorities and decision makers to be cognizant of the issues they're facing and to decide how they're going to address them if they can address them. And sometimes it might be that the answer is we don't have the capacity to address this. So what I would say is that, from a municipal perspective, if a municipality is looking to try, for example, to cover its bases and reduce its potential liability in the law of negligence, one thing that a municipality might want to consider in that situation is, documenting the conversation, the discussion, the kind of decision making that has happened around making that inquiry. So, for example, if the municipality has gone to the trouble to say, we have this sense that that we might need sort of, some considerable infrastructure upgrades or what have you, let's look into how much that's going to cost. Let's evaluate, our capacity to do that. If documenting that along the way, and then ultimately, if all the figures come back and the municipality looks at that and says, we have no way of functionally engaging with this right now. Like we can't pay for this. We don't have the operating budget for this. Documenting that consideration, the deliberation that's happened, the gathering of information, and coming up with some kind of policy response. So maybe the policy response is, having collected this information and considered it and discussed it, we are not able to move forward with this particular path, but maybe there is something that a municipality can nevertheless do in that situation. Maybe the decision that is made is is not to do nothing, but maybe it's to seek sources of funding that might be able to help a municipality. So maybe there are some grants that might be available, or some or maybe there's federal or provincial support that might be possible. But maybe there's a decision that's made to continue looking for avenues rather than just to kind of stop there and say there's nothing we can do. But ultimately, I think, from a municipal liability perspective, it's really about documenting the attempts to kind of find the information and then choose a good path forward, and having a clear record of deliberative, informed, rational, good faith decision making around these issues. I hope that answers your question, Ashley.
It does. Thank you.
You can go ahead, Kathleen, with your next question.
Hi, Tina. Thank you very much for a fabulous presentation, and really looking forward to reading the final draft of the paper. My question, I guess, is to sort of loop back to the fact that municipalities derive all their authorities from the province. And in your reference to the Urban and Rural Planning Act, and the fact that basically planning is a discretionary authority at this stage in the game. And we only, for the benefit of others on the call, in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's only about half of our municipalities that actually have obtain development control authority under IRPA. So that's a fairly significant gap in terms of their ability to act in those areas. I guess my question to you is, in those particular areas where the ability on the part of a municipality to act with probably the most impactful range of powers in relation to flood risk zoning and what have you, does that responsibility not rest with the province then?
I think so. Yes. I would say that the work that we did for Climate Atlantic was very focused on municipalities, because that was the scope of the questions that we were given. But in Newfoundland and Labrador, and we see this elsewhere in some of the other Atlantic Canadian provinces as well, where you have local structures of whatever name that don't necessarily have planning control. Ultimately, I think where municipalities don't have those responsibilities, it's the provinces that retain those key responsibilities. And so then it's a separate question of, okay, well, under those circumstances, where are we going to start to look for the provincial responsibilities and liabilities, and what are the expectations on provinces? But we didn't dig into that in this report. That would be a great follow-up report potentially.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We have one more question we'll take from Danielle, and then we'll move on to our next presentation. So you go ahead.
Hi, thanks. That was a really excellent presentation, really informative. And sort of as a follow-up to Kathleen's question, and forgive me, I'm not super well versed in the sort of the powers granted to municipalities from the province, but I'm just curious to know if the municipalities that are more connected to the Municipalities Act versus those larger municipalities that have their own acts, if there be any sort of differences there around potential liabilities for oversight, for example, like the City of St. John's and Mount Pearl and Corner Brook, as compared to those smaller ones? Yeah.
Oh, it's a great question. I did look into this when preparing the report, but there are some small differences and some nuances in terms of the language that's used in the different acts. So and we do talk about this a little bit in the report. So like with respect to things like the common law of nuisance, for example, you see some things, some limitations of liability that are set out in some language in, say, the city of like the cities of Mount Pearl and Corner Brook Acts, but not in the City of St. John's Act. So that, there are some little differences there in terms of the actual legislation. But apart from that, and even those, they were fairly minimal. You saw mostly a lot of the same stuff being covered. And so So those are some differences, but on the common law side of things, and then the other areas that we talk about in the report, all of that should be pretty well the same. I wouldn't expect to see major differences there.
Thank you. And I see your question here, Julia. We will note this one, and Tina's actually going to be back on Friday for additional Q&A time. So we'll save this and make sure we get to it. For now, we'll move on to Joel. You should have screen sharing ability, Joel, if you want to get set up. And I'll just give a little intro for him. So Dr. Joel Finnis, if you're in any climate change stuff in Newfoundland, you've probably heard him talk before. He's a climatologist with Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador in the Department of Geography. Current research interests include efforts to include climate dynamics, communication of weather and climate risks, interpretation of climate projections for the purposes of adaptation planning, and coastal communities, and exploring green infrastructure that can be climate change solutions for that. And most importantly, Joel's work directly contributes to the emerging field of climate services. Work in this area includes generating climate guidance for Newfoundland and Labrador, organizing practitioner-focused workshops on climate coastal resilience, and serving both NGOs and government agencies focused on climate action. In this capacity, he frequently speaks about climate data, uncertainty, and risk with non-specialist audiences. So I will turn it over to you, Joel. You must unmute yourself.
There we go. Got
Yes.
it. All right. Yes. Hopefully this is all now working. We can see the screen all right here. Great.
Yep, all good.
All right. Look, I was asked to talk about climate data for decision makers, and that is such a broad topic. So we're going to try to sort of narrow in on some key concerns here, but just give you sort of a quick introduction to some of the resources that are available to you, and more importantly, give you a sense of how you might think about interpreting that information in the context of climate risk assessments. So some quick framing, right? First, need to recognize that climate is indeed changing, and the only plausible explanation we have is that it's due to human activity. So that's primarily our use of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, which then add carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas that promotes warming at the surface. Another key thing that we need to recognize is that at this point, many climate change impacts are unavoidable. In fact, as we've seen over the course of the last year, many climate impacts have already arrived, right? We're seeing the impacts of climate change in this province and across this country, and frankly, across the globe as we speak. And frankly, we've already committed to a certain amount of additional climate change already that we simply can't undo, we can't reverse. So yeah, we have to deal with those things. I need to stress, though, that the magnitude of climate change impacts is highly uncertain. And that's due to the fact that there's a lot of complex physics involved in trying to understand how carbon dioxide will impact various aspects of the climate system. It's also due to the fact that we're using climate models, which are frankly technological marvels, but are still much, much simpler than the true climate system, and as a result, imperfect and give us sort of some biased interpretations of what will happen in the future. And most importantly, it's still unclear how much action will be taken on this issue, right? So we have then a number of different possible futures that we're moving towards, and we usually describe those as different climate change scenarios, some that are more pessimistic and some that are less pessimistic. But all that introduces uncertainty in the magnitudes of climate impacts. That doesn't mean that we don't have enough information to act. We certainly do at this point have actionable information. We're very confident that we know the direction of climate change. We know a lot of those likely impacts, and we've got reasonable ranges of likely magnitudes for those various concerns, which means that we can start planning now, right? Even without knowing exactly how big those impacts might ultimately get. So you might ask yourself, what should I consider? And I'd stress that that's going to depend entirely on your community. And it's hard for me to answer that question for you specifically. Instead, what you should do is you should take a look at your environmental past, your history. You should identify what environmental challenges you faced before. You should take a look at neighboring communities and see what kinds of challenges they've faced. And from there, you should get an idea of the kinds of hazards that might be amplified for you in the future. You can also take a look at what you have built in your community and ask what infrastructure is exposed to these various environmental concerns. From there, you can ask, well, what kind of information do I have about what climate change will do to this? due to these concerns, these stresses on my infrastructure? Well, fortunately, there's more climate guidance available now than ever before. It's more accessible. It's presented in user-friendly tools and online visualizations to a greater degree than it was before. I want to stress that there's a lot of resources you can look at, and there's really ultimately no right answer, no right resource, or no right single value that you should be looking at. Rather, you should investigate a number of these different resources and piece together what it tells you about your particular community and its future climate. There are still challenges here, and a key one, a really important one, is that all of that climate guidance really is usually climate information. It tells us about means more often than extremes, but it's the extremes that people want to incorporate into their planning. So we need to extract then those high impact weather events from that climate information, and that's not a trivial task. In fact, some of the most important information is ultimately hidden in that climate-y stuff rather than the weathery stuff that I might be most concerned with when I'm planning and designing. I also need to stress that some types of risks are much easier to predict than others. So maybe we'll spend a lot of this talk then taking a look at some of these climate resources and thinking about how to translate what we see there into something that's actionable. So first, a quick cut of climate resources. If you want to find out what climate change is going to do for your community, there's a few very easy, rough introductory first stops that you can hit up. I'd highly recommend just messing around with the Climate Atlas of Canada or climateatlas.ca and the website for the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, notably their climatedata.ca website. Both of these have all kinds of nice little climate change summaries that you can dig into. You can select particular locations and take a look at what would be expected to happen in those locations. But again, they're going to be a little bit general, and they might not necessarily give you the information that you want for planning. Regional and local scale information that's suitable for those kinds of decision-making practices exist, but they generally have less consistent support and maintenance than these sort of national level efforts. Crucially, for Newfoundland and Labrador, we do have regional scale climate projections that are being produced for the entire province. These were produced back in 2018 most recently, and they should be on the Turn Back the Tide website, but unfortunately, and this has happened before, the links are dead, which is again an indication that sometimes this information, even when it's produced, isn't necessarily easily accessible. You should still be able to contact the Office of Environment and Climate Change and ask for this information. It's there, it's just the website's been changed around and some of these links have disappeared. Hopefully in the future, we'll see that other organizations are also housing some of this info. For example, we've got a new regional climate services organization serving Atlantic Canada at the moment. You've already heard about Climate Atlantic, I believe, in the last presentation. Ideally, eventually, these kinds of regional and local scale projections will be housed somewhere on Climate Atlantic's website, giving you sort of perhaps some more consistent access to it. And I'll stress that it's not just these 2018 projections. There's a lot of other various government reports and consultant reports for individual communities and academic studies that look at particular locations and might have some useful information in them. But frankly, it's often hard to find those and maybe even harder to take the information out and put it into practice. Still, there's a lot of information there if you want to go digging. Let's see what we get from the Climate Atlas of Canada. I can click on a particular grid cell and get back something that looks like this. It's just an overall report, climate summary for this location. Here I've picked St. John's. From this, what I'm going to get are summaries of precipitation, mean annual temperatures and seasonal temperatures, and a couple of different climate extremes listed here. Things like very hot nights, very hot days, very cold days, information about the frost-free season, etc. And I'll get back information for a historical past, 1976 to 2005, which gives me some context for where we were before climate change started kicking in. And then I've got projections, a range of projections, because we've actually run multiple models multiple times to get different interpretations of what the future could look like. And so we get a range of outcomes from low-end predictions, which I would strongly suggest that you more or less ignore. This isn't going to make you feel confident in that you're making good planning decisions. The means are perhaps something that are more relevant, and certainly don't ignore those high-end projections. That's sort of the outside risk that you might have to be able to tolerate. But you've got it for two different periods, sort of the mid-century here and the late mid-century. I want to stress that multiple different futures are reported in these summaries. You can take a look at a variety of different climate pathways or climate scenarios, from RCP 2.6, which assumes that we take strong action on climate change and rein in the problem relatively quickly, all the way up to RCP 8.5, which assumes that we don't take really any action on climate change and we just keep emitting greenhouse gases the way we have been. I want to stress that you can take a look at any of those things, but you really have to certainly take a look at 8.5, those pessimistic scenarios. And the reason for that is that the changes we have observed in our climate system to date most closely matches those pessimistic scenarios. See, there's a question there, RCP. Those are representative carbon pathways. Those are imagined carbon release trajectories into the future. Critically, those numbers going up means we've created more climate change. But yeah, so again, I just want to stress RCP 8.5, our most pessimistic scenario in many regards for Canada, seems to be too conservative at the moment, which means we have to consider it. And I'll point out that by the sort of late 21st century, the high-end projections for RCP 8.5 suggest that our future winter conditions will look like our current spring conditions, and our future fall will look much more like our current summer. Basically, climate change under this scenario is severe enough that it could erase St. John's winter. If that doesn't give you a sense of the scale of the problem here, I don't know what will. This is a wintry city. This is a city that gripes about winter like you wouldn't believe. Climate change may be strong enough to basically erase the winters that we're used to and replace it with an extended spring. That might sound comforting to a lot of you in this audience, but I want to stress that hidden inside of those discussions of warmer winter temperatures are all of these weather events that are going to cause incredible headaches for every community in this province. So it's all hidden in those climate summaries. We need to spend some time trying to extract out some of that weather again. What does an increased temperature mean for our temperature extremes, for our precipitation extremes, for our sea level and coastal erosion, right? It's a pile of other things that aren't even really strongly considered here at all, from winds to blizzards to heat waves and droughts. They kind of get touched on perhaps a little bit, but it's really hard to predict what's going to happen to some of these other events. But certainly temperature and precipitation extremes, we have good information that can help you consider these concerns. Same thing with storm surges and sea level rise and coastal erosion. If you're living in a particular community, you've got to spend a little bit of time taking a look at which parts of your community might be exposed to different challenges. If I'm living in this imaginary community up here on this slope surrounded by forests, I might have to worry about what high temperatures in the summer will do to litter on the forest floor and water stress in the plants, leading perhaps to increased fire risk. If we do get a fire, what will the removed vegetation do in terms of increasing our chances of slope failures? If I'm living in other parts of this community, down here in the river valley, I'll have to worry about what higher precipitation might do to river flooding. And if I'm living in any of these regions along the coast, I've got to worry about storm surges, coastal flooding, coastal erosion. So let's try to get into some of this translation from climate to weather. We've got increasing temperatures. Summer temperatures are going to go up, winter temperatures are going to go up. And again, that does introduce stresses to our population and our infrastructure. Critically, it introduces a lot of health stresses. We saw that this summer when unusually warm temperatures led to the cancellation of the Tele 10 race. We were concerned when all these people out there running in high heat would end up filling up our emergency rooms with folks suffering from heat stroke. It's an important reminder that we have not built our infrastructure in this city to withstand hot summers. We haven't included a lot of air conditioning units. A lot of our homes don't have those. As a result, we don't have a lot of shelter from high temperatures when they do occur. This, again, does produce some problems in terms of health for our population. Similarly, a lot of our infrastructure can get stressed by those higher temperatures and changes in resulting energy consumption patterns. If we do see frequently high temperatures in the summer, we might expect that more people are going to invest in air conditioners. That's going to crank up hot season energy consumption, particularly during those heat waves. Of course, it stresses our ecosystems too. So we've seen things like forest fires in the last year. which certainly were partially fed by unusually warm temperatures and dry periods. And of course, winter temperatures going up too, are going up as well. And that presents some challenges to many communities, particularly in places like, say, coastal Labrador, where we rely on cold temperatures to maintain snowmobile trails and pathways along sea ice, which we use in winter to get from community to community. We've seen a number of extreme thaws in the last couple of years that have rendered those bits of snowmobile infrastructure, natural infrastructure, utterly unusable and impassable, isolating some of these communities. So what about precipitation? Okay, so temperatures are going up, that introduces particular risks, but precipitation is also expected to increase. We expect on average more precipitation in every season of the year across this province. A lot of that comes as individual heavy precipitation events. So it's not just that it's evenly distributed with more rain events, it's that often we end up seeing precipitation happening in very heavy precipitation, individual heavy precipitation events. But there's also often an indication that, particularly in the summer season, the time between precipitation events on average could go up, which would mean that we've got dry periods followed by intense precipitation, followed by dry periods, followed by intense precipitation. This then raises concerns when it comes to our ecosystems and water stress, but it also raises concerns about flooding. And again, in the last year, we've seen numerous intense precipitation events causing some pretty damaging floods from one coast of this island to the other. So these are just images from some of those recent floods, all within the last 12 months. From a couple in St. John's, including Hurricane Earl, which dumped 172 millimeters in 3 days, flooding the Waterford River, to an intense precipitation event we had throwing rain on top of snow back in January of this year, which caused significant flooding in Rennie's River. We've also got on the other coast heavy rain events that have caused landslides, as well as, well, basically gutting of roads, right? For trying to understand how much our intense precipitation risk is going to change, it's useful to take a look at intensity, duration, frequency curves, which then relate for a given amount of time how much precipitation we could expect with a given likelihood. So this is relating the probability of a given intensity for a given duration for individual locations. We want to figure out how our risk of intense precipitation is going to change in the future. We can take a look at how those IDF or intensity, duration, frequency curves change. I'm sure everybody in this room has at some point heard somebody talk about the 100-year storm. It's this kind of calculation that gives us that 100-year event. What it means when I say the 100-year storm is I've got a storm that has a 1 in 100 chance of occurring every given year. If I take a look at current IDF curves, I can see that 100-year event, the likelihood of occurring of 1 in 100 every year, is related to an intensity for this particular location of about 130 millimeters falling in 24 hours. I've also got here then projected IDF curves. This is the average model projection for what the mid-century could look like for this location. And this is the high end then in red of those projections. And I can just follow this line across and see where we intersect those different IDF curves and get a sense of how my risk is changing. The mid-century projected mean takes my 100-year event and shifts it to be something more like the 25-year event. That means I only have a 1 in 25 chance of occurring every year. That's a 4 times increase in the likelihood of this heavy event. If I've designed a system to withstand the 100-year event using the current climate, I've now got a 4 times higher likelihood of bumping into that event and perhaps seeing my system fail. The high-end projections are even worse. They turn it into a 10-year event. This is a fairly regular occurrence. It's got a 1 in 10 chance of occurring in a given year. That's a dramatic increase in the probability of this particular flood. So I know that that's a lot of sort of statistical summary, but what it's telling you is that you've got a much higher likelihood of seeing these heavy precipitation events. They're going up by a factor of 4 to 10. And look, that data exists. That's been calculated for the province. It does exist, for example, in the 2018 Newfoundland climate projections. It also exists in a bunch of other reports generated for the province and for individual cities. You can find all kinds of information about how these IDFs might change into the future. And if you can't get access to those, Environment and Climate Change Canada has recommended a particular scaling tool, just a quick algebraic correction for your existing current IDFs to get you the future likely values. There's a link here that'll point you to that. It's just, again, found at the climatedata.ca website. So we'll carry on here and just quickly think about one last concern, our coastal erosion. This makes sense in Newfoundland and Labrador. Of course, many of our communities are coastal, which means that in many of our communities, some property and critical infrastructure are exposed to coastal erosion, which is just the result of water from the ocean pushing up against our coastline. That's a function of how high that ocean level is, which is of course related to our mean sea level, our sort of baseline sea level, combined with our tides, our regular normal fluctuation around that, and then storm surges, which is weather-driven increases in sea level as winds cause water to pile up in particular locations. Now, the concern with climate change, the main concern, is that our baseline is shifting. Sea level is rising and is expected to continue to rise for decades, if not centuries at this point. But on top of that, we also have shifting storm tracks and characteristics of our storms, which means we've got increased uncertainty and potential severity of our storm surges. So let's start with that baseline consideration. How much could sea level rise? Well, there's a recent report from the Geological Survey of Canada that gives you sort of maps showing the expected increase for all of Canada's coastlines. And they've suggested that using the RCP 8.5 climate scenarios, the severe ones that I've suggested we need to consider in Canada, it's reasonable to expect 60 to 80 centimeters of sea level rise by the end of the century. It's possible to get something higher, say 100 to 120 centimeters. They also present a worst case scenario, which is related to catastrophic melting of global glaciers that could push sea level up to maybe 140 to 160 centimeters. But I want to suggest that I grade that out because that's, again, worst case scenario, it's highly unlikely. But similarly highly unlikely are our best case scenarios associated with, say, an RCP 2.6, very optimistic scenario, which would only give us something on the order of 20 to 60 centimeters of sea level rise. So let's just think about what 60 to 80 might do. We've got visualization tools that can help map that out for us. You could go to Climate Central and their coastal risk screening tool and just take a look at what an increase of 70 centimeters in sea level might do to the areas of your coastline that are inundated. This tool will highlight in red regions that would be submerged during high tide for that given increase. But that again is just climate. That's the baseline increasing. What happens if we get a storm surge? Well, let's imagine, let's add a storm surge from a recent event to this increase. Let's add the 270 centimeter storm surge we saw from Fiona to the 70 centimeters that we would see from sea level rise. If that happens at high tide, this is the region of St. John's Harbor that would be submerged. It's going to be a lot more coastal erosion. That's going to be a lot more damage to coastal infrastructure. So that's one way to start thinking about what future storm surge events might look like. Take an extreme event, add on our sea level rise, and imagine what that could do to your community. But another way to think about this is, again, shifting risk. So we can also talk about storm surges as having these same return periods we talk about with precipitation. We could talk about the 100-year storm surge. And again, coastal infrastructure is often designed with those kinds of design criteria. We'll design it to withstand a 100-year storm surge or something along those lines. Well, this map is showing how much the risk factor of a storm surge with a given frequency will change for a 5-meter sea level rise. So this is from the last iteration of the IPCC reports. And you can see that our risk factor increases are extremely high in Newfoundland and Labrador, a factor of 1,000. What does that mean? Well, that means that an event like the 10-year event, which we might have expected on average maybe once every 10 years, becomes something that now happens 100 times a year. The 1 in 100-year event becomes something that we expect to see 10 times per year on average. And the extremely rare 1 in 1,000 event, the 1,000-year event, becomes something that we'd expect to see annually. Look, that's a massive increase in risk. And we might look at this and think, okay, well, that sounds like hyperbole. That sounds like we're exaggerating. But look, this is a 50 centimeter, half meter rise in sea level. Our actual 10-year storm surge event in St. John's is 0.9 meters. So a half meter rise in sea level accounts for more than half of that 10-year storm surge. It starts to make more sense that that risk factor is increasing by such a huge degree, so dramatically. Another way of thinking about this is a 5-meter sea level rise basically accounts for 19% of Fiona's storm surge, but it's not present just during the storm. It's there all day, every day, regardless of what the weather conditions are doing, regardless of what tide is doing, et cetera. So yeah, this certainly isn't an exaggeration. Our coastal erosion risk is amplifying rapidly. So a couple of key considerations that I'll leave you with here. First of all, if you're an elected official, you might want to just recognize that you don't actually need to know everything about climate change. I strongly encourage that you trust your planners and your engineers, but just insist that they consider climate change in their reports, recommendations, and designs. And spend a lot of time paying attention to those more pessimistic scenarios and predictions, okay? So when they give you a range of potential planning options, remember that we're currently moving towards some of those worst case scenarios. Hopefully this will change due to climate action, but honestly, if I'm investing in coastal infrastructure at the moment, I probably wouldn't want to bet on that. If you're an engineer or a planner, look, I want to stress that your risk assessment and design criteria tools still work. You just have to add climate severity to this. I encourage you to plan for the worst, hope for the best, but you really have to consider those more extreme scenarios, the 8.5, et cetera, for a couple of reasons. One, in Canada, they've proven to be too optimistic to date. They underestimate sea ice loss, they underestimate ocean warming, they've underestimated the amplification of warming in the Arctic. They aren't capturing the changes that we've actually seen. We need to recognize that they might be too optimistic. Also, I want us to recognize that while there's a lot of talk about climate action and climate mitigation, actions are still slow. We still aren't taking action quickly enough to prevent some of the worst outcomes and the biggest climate surprises. So yeah, we're still moving in the wrong direction. With that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have about this material.
Thank you, Joel. You took our prompt and did what we hoped you would do. So thank you very much. We are close to what we scheduled as the break time, but if you don't want to break, we can take questions until the next presentation if we like to. There might be a bit of shock happening. Yes, Chris, you go ahead.
Thanks, Joel. As usual, really great presentation. Every time I hear you talk, I learn something new, and I've heard you talk a number of times. So, and I'm getting used to not being so freaked out and scared now. One, I guess, a combination of this presentation as well as the previous one. One thought that keeps coming back to me, and then Ashley and others, you can decide when it's appropriate to dive in here. Insurance industry. I mean, numbers like this, I mean, you know, you talk about municipal officials and elected officials, et cetera, but it seems like everywhere that I'm aware of, it's the insurance industry that's really paying attention to this and actually making some decisions based on this. Is that, Joel and others, are we aware how the insurance industry is starting to look at this and use it either at the municipal scale, at the provincial scale, or even an individual sort of personal homeowner scale? I mean, obviously that there's a high risk there for folks on the insurance side, and it seems like they could be a driver in a lot of ways. I'm just curious as to any of you have had interactions with them kind of with this sort of conversation, or what you might know there. Thanks.
So this isn't an area that I cover myself, but I do have colleagues who spend a lot of time thinking about the insurance industry and having conversations with people in the insurance industry. And yes, they're thinking about this, they're planning around this. They are putting pressure on government to take certain responsibilities and absolve them of certain others. The expression that I hear most often from the insurance industry is that climate change is a whole of society problem. It's not our problem. It's not our problem as an industry. It's everybody's problem. And that's an indication they recognize that a lot of the insurance bets that have been placed in the past are currently losing bets, right? Yeah, they're stepping up to raise alarm bells, and they're certainly pushing government to make decisions. And they're pushing government to make decisions that are in favor of the insurance industry and not their clients, and not the average Canadian member of the public, right? So, you know, yes, they push forward on this, but they're pushing in a direction that is certainly in their self-interest, and that's understandable, right? But we need to pay attention to what they're saying and what they're pushing, and we need to know when, as again, a whole of society, we need to push back a little bit.
So I can see in the chat there that Charles had a similar question. I think what we will do, and thank you, Chris, is we will follow up because there, I was on CBC a few weeks ago talking with someone who is like a not-for-profit associated with the insurance industry, who the mission of that organization was essentially trying to work with communities to lower their risks so that the insurance companies was exposed to less risk of having to have like really big claims. And I feel like that in and of itself is like a whole topic of discussion that we probably haven't included very much here, because the focus of this was trying to help people move through like a climate vulnerability exercise. But as follow-up to this conference, we will be putting together a package, and we will include some information and some links about that to help address and be comprehensive about all of the things that we're having to think about to take action on what is a quite complex problem. Okay, are there any other questions for Joel?
And as with Tina, Joel will be back on Friday for an extended Q&A. So if you don't have anything now and something comes up, jot it down for later.
Yes, absolutely. So Joel, as always, gives us some sobering context with which to address a problem. So I think, Emma, if it's okay with you, what we'll do at this point is we will take a 7-minute break. We'll come back at 10:50. Everybody try and take a big old deep breath, and we'll dive in and try and focus on the things that we can do with the information that we have.
Sounds good.
Okay. It's saying 10:50 a.m. on my clock, so I think we will get started here again. Emma, are you in good shape?
Yep, all good.
Excellent. Okay. So this part of the presentation, we're going to dive into the workshop series intentions and goals, and just talk about what we're hoping to accomplish over the course of the week. So as Professor Durayo mentioned this morning, this is part of the Building Regional Adaptive Capacity and Expertise program that is funded through NRCan. Our conference is looking at a collaborative approach on how we build capacity and expertise to address climate resilience and adaptation. And the project is being delivered in partnership with Memorial University, the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, PEG-NL, Engineers Canada, Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador, NLAP, and Fundamental was engaged to support the process. And we also have on here other informal partnerships with organizations like Climate Lentic. So how do I move forward with there, okay, I have to use my my mouse. So welcome, and thank you for coming. I hope the presentations this morning were helpful, and if you missed them, they are recorded, and we will be sharing them like publicly once the conference is completed. So before I dive straight into this particular conference, I do want to give a bit of a background on how we arrived at the conference structure and content. So in February, March of this year, we partnered with EcoNext to deliver a survey on climate action in Newfoundland and Labrador communities. So I'm going to pull up this here now. Give me 1 second. It's opening on my other screen, and I will drag it over. And so through that survey, we were able to get 42 respondents, which included 3 Indigenous communities, and we conducted 19 one-on-one interviews with municipal staff, and we represented 33 unique communities and 9 anonymous respondents. And we did manage to cover a good part of the province, which we were quite happy with, to make sure that we got clear representation from the diversity that happens in our province. We looked at results that covered very small communities to very large communities, which is also very helpful. We did discuss the current level of climate action. This was one of the key questions. In the majority of communities that responded, it was acknowledged that climate change has been discussed, but no planning or action has been taken. In some cases, climate action planning had begun. In some cases, climate action plans are available and actively being implemented. This was largely for larger communities. And then there's action plans that were available but not implemented. And in some communities, climate change had never been discussed at the top parts of municipal levels. A second of the key questions was then looking at climate priorities. The question was formed as what is the highest climate priority? So coastal flooding, inland flooding were the top 2, followed closely by race reduction and diversion. And then followed by food security, community engagement and public education, green space and ecosystem protection, and wildfire. And then, although it was still priorities, there was a clear, significant statistical difference between large communities and small communities. So larger communities also ranked higher for building energy retrofits, renewable energy installations, vehicle electrification, and public and active transportation systems. And looking at sort of non-infrastructural or non-built form impacts of climate change, loss of sea ice, vulnerabilities to cultural identity, and vulnerabilities to built heritage were all also priorities, most significantly for Labrador respondents and areas where there's a heavy tourism component to the economy. So there's some additional quotes that I'm not going to read, but this will be made available, actually is available on EcoNext website and Fundamentals website. So a key thing that we did ask were, what were the barriers to action? So the top 2, as you might imagine, are time and money, or some combination of those things. Capital to address and capital to pay for studies and design to be undertaken. Lack of staff time and expertise, very closely related to everybody's really busy, just keeping the town operational, and so doesn't have time to take on what is a significant and complex issue. Lower in the rankings were sort of a lack of climate change understanding and awareness, and a lack of community support, although still not insignificant, and a lack of staff or council support. So as a follow-up question to that, we said, okay, what supports do you feel are most needed? Sharing of funding opportunities, support for completing funding applications, facilitation of partnership between communities, facilitation of climate action related training. These were the top ones, followed closely by connections with climate experts and consultants, and assistance with public engagement efforts. Assistance with interpreting climate science and projections, and the sharing of case studies. So all those supports were listed as generally helpful. We did ask communities like what areas of climate action are currently being undertaken. Thank you, Emma. In the chat, you'll see a link to this infographic if you want to go over it on your leisure. And so you can see there's quite a wide variety, which is very exciting. And those were the results of the first survey we did, trying to understand where Newfoundland and Labrador municipalities sat with respect to climate action. Following up that survey, we did a webinar in partnership with municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Kathleen is on the line here. Kathleen was a part of that webinar. And during that webinar, we relayed the information from the infographic I just showed you, and then asked some follow-up questions. So focusing on adapting to climate change, what did you see as the top priorities for your community? And so that came in as coastal issues, inland flooding, followed pretty closely by ecosystem protection, loss of cultural heritage, gathering support for climate action. And then we didn't have something else in this case. And then what stands in the way of climate action in your town? The highest was finding funding, staff time and expertise, and too busy with day-to-day, which maps really closely with the previous survey that we did, which was exciting from our perspective in terms of narrowing down on how we can create tool and exercise to support folks moving forward. And so the last exercise that we did to try and narrow down exactly what format we should deliver the conference in, we did in July to September of this year on Google Forms, and it was sent out. We asked folks because we had originally thought, well, we would try and do in-person workshops across the province, but of course, with a limited budget, we can't go to every single community, even if we'd like to. And folks willing to travel more than 90 minutes, like for in-person, waned significantly, but exclusively virtual was as high as virtual attendance of an in-person workshop. This turned out to be logistically very difficult, and so we went with exclusively virtual, which is why we're all online right now. And what time of day would you prefer? A short to medium workshop, which was the highest ranking in the morning, came back as the most. And so here we are between 9:30 and 11:30. And I suppose most importantly, looking at what topics did folks want to hear about, what would be most worthwhile in terms of engaging with the time. And there was a lot. And so we worked really hard to figure out how do we hit all of these targets. And so we've landed on the detailed agenda that we're currently looking at. I'll acknowledge here that Climate Atlantic is also working on some of these, specifically around flood risk mapping and making connections among folks who are interested in climate action to create a community of practice. And we know here, anyone who's on the call wears a lot of hats, whether you're a municipal staff person or official, whether you're a consultant and a professional, whether you're a student, you wear a lot of hats in a day. And we do want to make this sensible and worthwhile. So in terms of a targeted arc for the conference activities, we're looking today through the course of the week. So today looks at understanding how to use data, outlining the point and the purpose of the conference, which is what this activity is, and then familiarizing ourselves with Miro Board, which will be the interactive portion of the workshops that are with the conference Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. The idea being that as we take the arc across the week, so we've got today where we sort of set the frame based on a legal context and a available best quality climate data, and understanding what that looks like. Tomorrow is going to be the the map that Joel included in his presentation, Emma will take you through following my conversation here. But we're going to look at vulnerability identification in a fictitious town that essentially has all of the troublesome things that the 30 to 50 communities that we've worked with over the past couple of years are addressing, and we've kind of smashed it all into several zones of one place, so that we can look at how do we engage with the available climate data, its level of certainty, its uncertainty, to identify what key vulnerabilities are within this fictitious place, and how do we go through a risk tolerance evaluation. And so that ties very closely with Joel's comment about what risks should I consider, what information or data do I have available to take action, how do I identify risks that I'm willing to tolerate versus not tolerate, and we will do that in a sort of detailed level. Wednesday, we'll focus on engineered solutions. So looking at when you have collaborative project teams made up of technical or not technical and technical and non-technical people, you're all aiming at the same objective to address a climate action. Understanding like where the bounds of engineering can help, and like what goes beyond the bounds of engineering. And what sort of sits with the town in terms of making decisions in the best interest of the town and the residents. So that's Wednesday with the engineering. Thursday, we'll be looking at planning and policy, adopting a climate lens on organizational decision making. So how you look at that base understanding of where your vulnerabilities sit, how do you layer that onto your municipal documents, or if you don't have a municipal document, how you still integrate that into a community being able to take action and address the risks that Joel quite soberingly put in front of us. Friday will be sort of a consolidation, a review. There'll be a question and answer forum with a panel consisting of Kathleen Parawick from MNL, Sefer Khosravi from Climate Atlantic, Marina, I'm going to say your last name wrong and I apologize, Kuseli, who's a PhD student with Memorial University and who focuses on coastal impacts of climate action, as well as Joel Finnis, Joe Durayo, myself and Emma. And this will be a panel, but then an open Q&A to dive down into specific issues. We'll talk a little bit about how you prioritize in a really complex set of circumstances, and how you identify like one or two of their sort of like top issues that you can take action on, because trying to do everything all at once is often not effective. And our understanding of the current availability for funding applications and how they fit, so that folks can address the money aspect of it. So, oops, what happened? I apologize, folks. There is a last slide that for whatever reason will not come up. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll just talk to you. So in terms of the conference workshop learning objectives, this was identified on the detail agenda. So what we're hoping, click to exit. So what we're hoping is that folks will gain a high-level understanding of the steps and activities involved in conducting a basic climate vulnerability assessment. So executing risk assessment tools and risk tolerance evaluations for municipalities under those differing scenarios, and how you make decisions that make sense for your community. How to prioritize multiple climate action initiatives and projects so that you can take action on something. And then how you integrate a climate lens onto like all municipal levels of decision making. So the ideal learning outcome here is that we understand how in a collaborative way you can either conduct a basic climate vulnerability assessment on your own within a municipality, or have a clear understanding of what to ask for and how to engage external supports. Looking at the idea of that, it's a real big problem and we're all in this together, and we're going to have to work together to sort it out. So a collaborative approach is understood to be an effective way to address this. So going forward, Emma, if you are able to take over now, we're going to get into doing explanation and test of Mira board, which is an online whiteboard. And just make sure that everybody can use it properly and engages with it and understands how, because in order for this to be very successful, we need folks to engage and be comfortable with the platform. So without further ado, Emma.
Yeah, so I just put a link in the chat. So first step for everyone will be to check that and click it. And hopefully you'll be sent to your browser and it should allow you to open it. You don't need an app or anything. There is an app, but you don't need to download that. And you're given the option to add your name or stay anonymous, whatever you prefer. And it'll also prompt you for your email, but you don't need to put that in. That's just an option. So yeah, this last bit of today is just a chance to get familiar with this board, because this is what we'll be working on. There's a lot of people in here now, but we're going to be in breakout rooms with much fewer people. So there will be less crowding of arrows here. But for now, we're all going to just be in this test board. So I have a few sticky notes there with a few of the ways that this works. It kind of depends on your device, how you can move around and zoom and things. So you can read this. This is some of the ways. Depending on if you're on a trackpad or using a mouse, there are different ways to zoom and move around. Right-clicking can do it. If you hold your right button, you can drag yourself around. One thing I'll also do here, in case anyone is not in, I'm going to share my screen so you can at least see what I'm talking about. And we'll do this in the sessions as well. So if you can't access this for whatever reason and we're in a breakout room, we'll have the facilitator share their screen so that you can still see what's happening even if you're not in there. So to move around the board, right now I'm clicking on the right side of my mouse. On my mouse, I can also click on the scroll button and I can move around this way. And then zooming in and out will be something we'll have to do. So your scroll button can do that. Command or Control plus can do that. There is also zoom buttons on the bottom here, bottom right. So that's really all you'll have to do. We're not going to use a lot of the features of this, but we will be using these sticky notes. So I have one here, this yellow one, as a test, but you can also grab it from the toolbar on the left. It looks like a square with a little corner folded, and you can grab one and pick a color and then type away on that. And that's how we'll be getting everyone's thoughts down. So this will serve both as like a brainstorming engagement tool, but it also will help record what we're doing. So you'll all be in your own breakout room link. So there'll be a separate link from this. So we won't use this link again tomorrow or any other day. There'll be a separate one for you when you get into your breakout room. And then at the end of the whole week, we'll PDF the whole thing. So we're going to use it as a little data record thing as well. So feel free to do whatever you like, fooling around here. But I'm going to move over. Oh, one thing I'll test actually. Another thing we can do, the facilitator can do, so you'll each have a facilitator in your breakout room, is bring you to them. So I'm going to do it now. And you all should suddenly see what I see. So I'll drag all your mice over to zoom in on whatever I'm doing. As soon as you click somewhere else, you'll stop following me. So I'm going to zoom now, and you should zoom with me if you're still following me. If you have stopped, you won't, but that's fine. You can either go up to the top here and you'll see all the names. I don't have a picture, so that's not very helpful. But if you find an Emma Power in the list of people, you can click to follow me, I believe. So I can follow any of you, I think. But you'll want to follow your facilitator, and you'll know who that is. When you get into your breakout room, they'll introduce themselves. And that's a way you can figure out where everyone else is or where your facilitator is if you're a little bit lost. Also, just zooming out really far can help, and you can see where other people's mice are and follow them. So hopefully that works pretty good. And as you can see here, we have our map. Joel gave you a little sneak peek without all of the annotations and stuff. But this is what we're going to work with for the rest of the week. So as Ashley talked about, we wanted a way to bring all of these concepts together in a way that makes sense and would be really helpful when you go back to your own municipality. So we made this fake place, which kind of incorporates all of the different things we've heard from places that we have worked with across the province. A little fire emoji, that was cute. Anyway, you can do lots of fun stuff here. So what we're going to do, we have it broken out into these zones just to make it easier to focus our discussions in the coming days. So everyone will be looking at all of these zones at a different time. When we do our analysis, of course, this is only a 20-minute, not 20, 2-hour session altogether. And then when we get into each session and break apart the zones, we won't have a whole lot of time to look into each one. So the idea is not to be thorough and identify every possible vulnerability everywhere, but we're just going to do what we can to get our minds going and wrap our heads around how the process works so that you can return to it later or put your own map on a Miro board sometime and have an idea of what to do and where to start. So that's how that all works. Above the map, if you're still following me, you should come. We have a sample climate projections table. So this is similar to what Joel showed. And we just grabbed some, they're not random, they are Newfoundland specific numbers, but for a particular place, which I will not disclose, but it's from climatedata.ca. And so if you wanted to look up your own community, you could still find these same factors here on the website. So I've grabbed numbers for 1980, so you can see historical information, and that's just to help give us an idea of where we're starting from or where we started from a while ago. And then we have an intermediate target of 10 years from now, and we have ranges here. So Joel talked about the RCP 8.5, and that's what we grabbed here. But even within that scenario, there's a range. So there's a range of scenarios, and there's a range within the scenarios, and there's always uncertainty. So we wanted to tie that in so that we're looking at that the way we would for real. So we have 2033, 10 years from now, and then a 2080 number. And this table is just here to reference as we're thinking about this map. So we won't, necessarily analyze each of these numbers, but if we're looking at zone 3 and we're thinking about this river system, we might want to be looking up here in the precipitation area to see what we should be thinking about. So if you have any questions or having any trouble with this, let us know either in the chat now, in an email later, whatever. And yeah, that's really it. So just moving around, zooming, sticky notes, moving your sticky notes around. That's all we'll have to do. Don't worry about anything else you might see, although you're welcome to draw a little picture if you like, or whatever makes you happy. But we won't be using we'll be using Zoom for the video and audio and everything, even though Miro can do that actually. Yes, each breakout room will have its own board. So when we split up tomorrow and the next days, you'll have a separate link once we break out. Another thing we're going to do shortly is test the breakout. So this is our first time organizing a kind of large online thing like this. I've attended lots, but it's our first time behind the scenes. I have learned how many settings there are in Zoom. So we want to make sure that it works fine. I noticed when I sent the reminder email, some people were sent to register again, which is not what I intended. Some people got in fine. So I'm not quite sure what's going on with those links. Hopefully I'll figure it out for tomorrow's email. But if you did register, which most of you did, it should also be in the confirmation email that you got after you registered or in your calendar invite. So hopefully there's less trouble tomorrow with that. So Jeff is our tech guy. If you see the name Jeff in the chat or in the participants list, he is with us with Fundamental, and he's behind the scenes setting up the breakout rooms, and he's going to do some of the sending us away, bringing us back, and broadcasting some chat messages to us. So we're going to test that function right now, Jeff, if you'd like. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And what you'll see is you'll be automatically sent to a room. We've set the timer because we're going to use the timer tomorrow and the next days. The minimum time you can set is 1 minute. So we're going to break out for, okay. Everyone should be back, I believe. So yeah, that was just a quick test of our breakout rooms and our automatic coming back and leaving. So hopefully no issues there. And if there are, just let us know. Cool. So that's basically it. We just wanted to make sure there was time for everyone to check their ability to access the Miro. We won't talk too much about this map yet, since that's the focus of tomorrow, but you're welcome to look at it in this link as long as you like. We do have some basic information about each zone, selected information to get your thoughts going. And tomorrow we'll focus on identifying some of the vulnerabilities you may already be noticing. Anything else to add, Ashley, or you think we're good?
Well, I'd just like to open the floor to anyone who may have a broad set of questions. It's not always easy or comfortable to talk in a big group, and we want to be inclusive. So please feel free. You can message Emma or I individually by adjusting the chat to our names, and you can message us directly if you don't want to put a group message in, or if you're comfortable, you can either turn your video on and talk, or leave your video off and talk, or ask any questions. The idea being that, we're doing this remotely based on what folks thought was the most likely way that they join, and we do want people to be comfortable and participate. So anything we can do to help with that comfort level, that's within our power, we will do. So just a sort of an open floor for that. Otherwise, I think we're good. So if folks are comfortable, you are welcome to go ahead, and we'll see you tomorrow at 9:30. Otherwise, Emma and I will stay here in the Zoom for another 10 minutes or so if anyone has questions.